listening to a CV like that, the only thing you can say is I'm getting old. Because a lot of the things were said about the distant past. I chose this theme: has Pope Francis revolutionized the social teaching of the Church? The answer is yes, but probably not in the sense you're thinking of. One of the big difficulties with Pope Francis is that we all like what he says when he says what we like. And even there I have to qualify and say that rather than what he says what we like, it's when we like what he thinks he says. We have to learn to listen to Pope Francis and to listen sometimes a little bit more carefully. Pope Francis is the master of the one-liners, which is a great gift in the Twitter age. But one-liners are like the parables of the gospel. If you get it, you get it. But if you don't get it, and if you begin to hyper-analyze, then you get it completely wrong. And we have to always interpret what he says in that sense. I think it's important to say that I chose the title before I attended the recent Extraordinary Synod of Bishops on the family, where many, I believe, failed to understand Pope Francis. The Synod of last month was not the Synod of confusion. Many would ask you, why this idea of confusion that's spreading in the mass media? It came from various ways. Very few would have criticized the Pope himself about the Synod, but some came quite close to it. Others blamed the Synod, the media. Others pointed their fingers at those who express views which are not their own. And there are also those who don't like some of Pope Francis's comments on social and economic questions. Regarding the social teaching of the Church, he has himself noted that people have called me a communist. Others say that his vision is limited. Well, he only knows Latin America, and he really only knows Argentina, which is a very particular case, and he doesn't understand the market. But I remember when Sollicitudo Rei Socialis was written, Pope John Paul II was accused of advocating moral equivalence between communism and a market economy. And as far as I can remember, Pope John Paul was not a communist. So what's happening is, we're all trying to put Pope Francis into categories. But very often these categories are our own categories, our own thought patterns with which we can be locked and in which we may find it hard to understand others. So in trying to understand how Pope Francis is revolutionizing the social teaching of the Church, I think it might be helpful to take some time reflecting on his methodology around the Synod. And also it may help us to understand the Synod himself. The first thing is that the Pope has ideas not about a synod, but about synodality. He thinks not about an event, but a process, a dynamic, a different way of living the reality of the Church, living the realities within the Church, and living the reality of the way we interact with others. He said, we must walk together, the people, the bishops, and the Pope. Synodality should be lived at various levels. We don't have a great tradition of synodality in the Western Latin Church, as you would have in the Orthodox churches or in the Protestant churches. In Ireland, we had a national synod in 1956, and it had the great task of updating canonical norms and enforcing priestly discipline. The Australian bishops had one the following year, and they said they'd improved on the Irish synod, because the Irish synod said that priests should not place money on horses, and the Australians said priests should not place money on horses either themselves or through other people, because apparently priests' housekeepers weren't just making tea. Synods, however, are not parliaments where everything is decided by vote and by majority. Synods are not something Protestant, as some people were saying about the last synod. Synodality is a tradition of the entire Catholic Church around which we have to refine what it means. Now, looking at the synod, the first thing is that Pope Francis said that one of the preconditions for a synod is boldness in speech and expression. And he encouraged everyone to do that. I'll read the words he said at the opening of the synod. Speak clearly. Let no one say this cannot be said. It's necessary to say everything one feels with parrhesia. It's a word which means bold and courageous speech. And then he said, at the last consistory, when there was discussion on the family, a cardinal wrote to me and said, too bad that some cardinals did not have the courage to say some of the things they were thinking, because the Pope might have thought differently. He said, this is not good. This isn't synodality, because it's necessary to say everything that one feels should be said in the Lord, without human respect or without fear. And at the same time, we must listen with humility and welcome and open heart to what our brothers are saying. Without these two attitudes, one does not practice synodality. Now, already there were those who were made uneasy by such a statement. How could a pope leave everything open to discussion, people said. Isn't it the Pope's task to foster and maintain unity and purity of doctrine? Was he saying that some fundamental teachings on marriage and the family were open gain for discussion? Now, Pope spoke in no way talked about a redimensioning of his own authority or a rewriting of the doctrine of the Church. He said very clearly at the end of the Synod, the Pope's authority is supreme, full, immediate, and universal. That's pretty strong reaffirmation of his authority. But he said that doesn't mean that he should exercise the authority as a supreme Lord. He said, my mandate, he said, is to be guarantor of the adhesion of the Church to the will of God, to the gospel of Christ, and to the tradition of the Church. And then in a very remarkable speech at the end of the Synod, he tried to tease out what open discussion means and what are the temptations that we can fall into which would hinder fruitful and bold discussion. And he reminded his hearers of the temptations into which all of us can fall. It was a very interesting speech because he said this, and you were sitting there, and he said he's criticizing that crowd. And then all of a sudden, he said the next stage, and he said he's criticizing me. So it's very easy to use Pope Francis's phrases to point them at others rather than pointing them at your own heart. So the first temptation was what he called hostile inflexibility, wanting to close oneself within the letter, the written word, and not allowing himself or oneself to be surprised by God. God is the God of surprises, and we want to remain within the law, within the certitude we know, and not of what we still need to learn and achieve. Not what we still need to learn and achieve. And he said this is the time a temptation was there since the time of Christ. He said it's today the temptation of the traditionalists and also the intellectuals. Now, I'm not precisely too sure whether professors at Villanova University he was speaking about as the intellectuals, but he didn't specify that. But alongside, then he spoke of the other temptation, the temptation to a destructive tendency to cheap goodness. He spoke of deceptive mercy, which binds the wounds without first curing and treating them, that treats the symptoms, not the causes and the roots. You see, that's the temptation of the do-gooders, of the fearful, and even of the progressives and liberals. Then finally he brought them together and he said, there are some who taught the others the temptation to neglect the deposit of faith. But there's also the temptation to neglect reality, making use of meticulous language and a language of smoothing, to say many things and to say nothing. And Pope Francis went on to say, the temptations should not frighten or disconcert or even discourage us. And he summed up the debate with these phrases. I would have been very worried and saddened if we didn't have these temptations and these animated discussions and this movement of the Spirit, as St. Ignatius calls it, if we were all silent in a false and quietist peace. Instead, and this is the Pope summing up at the summer of the Synod, which I think we should all read. I have seen and I've heard with joy and appreciation speeches and interventions full of faith, of pastoral and doctrinal zeal, of wisdom, of frankness and of courage, without ever putting into question the fundamental truths of the sacrament of marriage, the indissolubility, the unity, the faithfulness, the fruitfulness, and that openness to life. He didn't seem to come away with confusion. He came away with a very different picture. So I spoke at length about the Synod. Also to Because I think it's important that we realize what the Pope wished to say, and that there was no rejection or undermining of the teaching of the Church. But I speak about the Synod because I feel we can find here some keys into how Pope Francis addresses the social teaching of the Church and how he may be revolutionizing it. Because the Pope's final speech of the Synod shows how he wishes to examine the relationship between the realities of faith and the realities of the lives of men and women in our time. And he wants to do that. What's the key? It's a type of theological discernment. He doesn't come with ready-made answers. He looks at the realities and he says, what is this saying to us in today's world, and how do we as a church respond to it? That was his approach to themes of marriage and the family. That's the way he develops his reflections on the social teaching of the Church. The social teaching of the Church is not abstract reflection and analysis. In the first place, it's a call on the Church to be close to people, especially those most in need, and those who need closeness, those who need accompaniment, the troubled, the anxious, the lonely. This idea of closeness, the phrase that we heard there, about accepting, understanding, and loving others. The social teaching of the Church and the social action of the Church, the task is to bring the closeness and the intimate care of Jesus towards those who need it, and in so restoring them to the men and women they were called to be. So with that in mind, I'd like to look at how Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium develops this understanding of the social teaching and the social care as a way of representing the closeness of Jesus to those who are forlorn, abandoned, marginalized, and tormented. In the first place, the approach of the Pope to the social teaching of the Church isn't political or sociological, but fundamentally theological. He rejects a pure sociological analysis employing neutral and clinical method. His approach is characteristic of what he calls the missionary disciple of Jesus. In Evangelium Gaudii, and in the final documents of the Latin American bishops' conferences, which he had a major role in, you very rarely find the term laymen and laywomen. He talks fundamentally about the missionary disciples of Jesus. Therefore, that's the fundamental thing about it being a Christian. Layman, woman, religious, priest, we're all missionary disciples of Jesus. And the approach to the social teaching of the Church is, what does being a missionary disciple of Jesus mean to me in the light and the strength of the Spirit? And it again asks from me evangelical discernment, not ready-made answers. And he sees that this theological reflection on social realities is part of the task of proclaiming the gospel. He says, accepting the first proclamation, which invites us to receive God's love and to love in return, brings forth in our lives and actions a primary and fundamental response. So the very minute we hear the gospel message, there's a primary and fundamental response, and that is to desire, to seek, and to protect the good of others. Now listen to that. The desire is to seek, to protect, and to desire, to seek, and protect the good of others. He doesn't say the task is to think about and to reflect upon the good of others. The Christian's response to those who are excluded is to bring the closeness of Jesus to them through being close to them. So there's an inseparable bond between accepting the message and of salvation and genuine love, genuine fraternal love. And in Evangelium Gaudii, he has these two fantastic phrases. God's word teaches us that our brothers and sisters are the prolongation of the incarnation for each of us. The incarnation is prolonged because he says, as you did it to one of these, my brothers, you did it to me. So working and being close to brothers and sisters in need, you're prolonging the incarnation. And the other is that the way we treat others has a transcendent dimension. The measure you give will be the measure you will get. So the Pope's approach is theological. But he doesn't say that the gospel or the teaching of the church can be simply and directly applied to contingent and changing realities of the day. Social teaching of the church must always be open to look at the fruits of the social sciences and to remain in critical dialogue with them. The Pope doesn't claim for himself or for the church a monopoly on the interpretation of social realities or the solutions that there are. The responses of the church must always be open to legitimate, scientific, and even political interpretations. But the Pope also stresses that the social teaching of the church can't remain totally in the abstract and just enunciate general principles. He says the church's pastors, taking into account the different sciences, have a right to offer opinions that affect people's lives, since evangelization implies and demands the integral promotion of each human being. He says, we know that God wants his children to be happy in this world too, even though they are called to fulfillment in eternity. For he has created all things, and he quotes from first letter of Timothy, all things for our enjoyment. But then he adds, all things for our enjoyment and the enjoyment of everyone. There's nothing personal. The goods of the earth were given for us all. Pope Francis stresses that the interaction of theology and closeness to those who do not enjoy the goods of creation is a task for all believers, pastors and laymen and women. After the Vatican Council, Pope Paul began to look at two specific suggestions. One is to establish an office in the Vatican for the laity, which didn't exist, and the other one to deal with world hunger and justice issues. And it was proposed that maybe these things belong together. But Pope Paul said, no, the work for justice is not just the task of lay people. It may be principally that, but it's also the work of priests and religious. And in good Vatican tradition, he established two offices, but with the same president. Let's get closer to the way Pope Francis then tries to develop these ideas in a more concrete way. In Evangelium Gaudi, he says very clearly, go to the compendium of the churches, of the social teaching of the church, and you'll find that a useful tool for knowing and applying the body of the teaching. He said, what do I want to do in Evangelium? He said, I want to limit myself to look at some central issues which I feel will shape the future of humanity. So if we begin to look at these, they may provide us with another key to entering into the way Pope Francis looks at the social teaching. And he takes as the dominant theme, including the poor in society. Not looking after the poor, including the poor in society. And again, his reflection on this is theological. Why are we include the poor in society? He said, it's our faith in Christ Jesus, who became poor and was always close to the poor and the outcast, that is the basis of our concern for the integral development of society's most neglected members. It's because if we believe in Jesus Christ, who became poor and was close to the poor, then that will inevitably change the way we live as Christians. Every individual Christian is called to be an instrument of God for the liberation and the promotion of the poor and enabling them to become fully part of society. And that this commitment isn't a political imperative. It springs from the very nature of God, very nature of the God revealed in Jesus Christ. And if you look in Evangelium Gaudi, he gives a wide selection from the scriptures, which enables us to see how God listens to the cry of the poor and how he wants us to listen to the cry of the poor. So the fundamental option for the poor is not a political manifesto. It's implicit in our Christian faith. And that again is why the Pope in his ministry proclaimed that he wishes a church which is poor and a church for the poor. He wants to see the poor not just those whom we help, but as real protagonists within society and indeed within the church. And this latter one is quite an interesting, I'll just 3 quick phrases from it. He says, the poor evangelize us through their deep faith, and because they experience the suffering of Jesus Christ. The new evangelization offers an opportunity for us to acknowledge the saving power of Jesus is at work through the poor. We must embrace the mysterious wisdom which Christ wishes to share with us through them. They're very challenging words, that the poor are not people that we just do things for. But unless we listen to the poor, unless we understand the poor, then we will not grasp this mysterious wisdom of Jesus Christ. So the basis of our response is not simply one of analysis of poverty or of developing plans, but it comes, as I say, from the very definition of our being Christian. Social concern is not an optional extra for our faith. We are God's instruments of hearing the poor, and if we turn deaf ears to the poor, then we're turning deaf ears to God. And if we lack solidarity with the poor, we're rejecting God. The social teaching of the church then presumes that the person is at the center of our concern, not just an intellectual framework, but it must always begin with real people, especially those who are wounded. Pope Francis is, apart from his ability with the one-liner, he's the master also of the symbolic gesture. For me, one of the most striking gestures was an encounter of the Pope with a young man whose face was completely covered in sores. And he stopped, got out of the car in the Jeep in the square, and he did not do what most of us would probably have done. Greeted him from a distance and asked him, or maybe his doctors, what disease does he have? What's the prognosis? No, he simply kissed him. The Pope saw here not a problem, but a person. I have another personal friend of mine who was presented to the Pope, and as she was there, her person was there, said, this lady has a son who is very troubled. And again, he didn't say, what's wrong with him? He said, what's his name? And she was so struck by this that 3 times he said, I will pray for, and gave his name. This real, you see, first of all, the person. And this is something I think we have to refine in our activity. I could give many other examples of how the person emerges again from the things. For example, one of the things the Pope has a strong thing about is wastefulness. He doesn't like to see waste of food, for example. And even in simple things, if we were sitting at a table and there was food which wasn't being eaten, and he will get up and he will bring that plate to another table rather than see it thrown out. But he criticizes our throwaway society in which we live. But he applies that not just to the wastefulness of food, but to a mentality in which the poor themselves become part of those whose worth is measured only in terms of economic usefulness. The poor become the waste. Now, what are the guiding principles then, which Pope Francis places as the pillars of the Church's response to the needs of the poor today? In Evangelii Gaudium, he presents us with a very explicit list of situations to which the Christian can only say no. Let's look at these. The first is no to an economy of exclusion. See, and we're coming back to this. It's clear for the Pope that having a precise understanding of the experience of exclusion is a prerequisite for undertaking evangelical discernment needed to formulate the Church's response. We're not going to formulate the Church's response only on economic analysis. He says when you experience, then you can then discern what the gospel is asking. And real life experience is the starting point of the Pope's reflection. The Pope, again, doesn't simply talk about exclusion. The first trip that he made outside Rome was to Lampedusa, an Italian island which is often the first encounter for migrants arriving by precarious boat journeys to Europe. And he went and he insisted, despite the fact that people said there are security reasons, the people he wanted to meet were the immigrants themselves. And his words about exclusion are very stark. Just listen to this. Just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of life, Today, we also have to say, thou shalt not kill, to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. So exclusion ultimately has to do with what it means to be part of the society in which we live. Those excluded are today no longer society's underside or its fringes or disenfranchised. They are no longer even part of it. The excluded are not the exploited, but the outcast. They are the leftovers. Fascinating. And then he addresses what he calls a globalization of indifference, which not only affects the lack of the opportunity of the poor. Again, he says, the globalization of indifference changes us, hardens us, and renders us insensitive as well. We end up being, he says, incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, or weeping at other people's pain, or feeling the need to help them, as though all this were someone else's responsibility and not ours. The culture of prosperity deadens us. When God created humanity, he created it as a family. This isn't a simple affirmation. This is the affirmation which gives us the real responsibilities of solidarity and a familial relationship of love, which should be the relationship between peoples. But it's also the principle which should guide the process of globalization. Globalization will be worthy of its name if it is actually global, if it enhances the unity of the human family. And any form of globalization that breeds exclusion, marginalization, instability and indifference and crass inequality really doesn't have the right to call itself global. Globalization has to be made the synonym of inclusive. But some of the changes that are taking place in our era of globalization make it more and more difficult to identify the processes which guide that formation of a different globalization. The complex balance between public and private sectors, the dominance of economic values over all others, the inadequacy of our international structures make the governance of globalization difficult. For example, in international relations, rules are very important, including, for example, trade rules. But we should always remember the basic principle that rules are there. Why? They're there to defend the more vulnerable and to restrain any tendency towards arrogance on the side of those who are more powerful. That's why we have rules in today's complex, in any world. But often in international negotiations, and I can speak from personal experience of many years, the rules are made and greatly influenced precisely by the powerful. The other point we should always remember, rules are necessary, but rules remain a naked skeleton unless they're covered in the flesh and blood of solidarity. That again is part of our task. We can have all the rules in the world, but unless they have a heart in them, they're not going to attain what they're there to do. The second no is a no to a financial system which rules rather than serves. Now, Pope Francis is aware of the need to generate wealth through healthy economic activity. He's not against the market. He's not against the need to generate the wealth that we need. What he stresses is the real meaning and the scope of an economy is not just that alone. In speaking to this year's World Economic Forum in Davos, his primary message was very simple. He said, without ignoring the specific scientific and professional requirements of every category, I ask you to ensure that humanity is served by wealth and not ruled by it. It was interesting, it was the first time that the Pope sent a message to the World Economic Forum, which is a forum of those of the powerful in the economic world. And the president of the World Economic Forum that said that afterwards, in their analysis, the quote that was most quoted in all the messages and the tweets and so on was this one. I ask you to ensure that humanity is served by wealth and not ruled by it. It's also interesting that the Pope, about 3 weeks ago, spoke to something quite the opposite to the World Economic Forum, the meeting of social movements in a very different context, and he has no problem speaking to either. When we talk about world financial systems, we have to recover our awareness that the market and the economy are indeed part of a broader picture, and that there are other values more important than economic values. We need especially to foster those economic values which will be in the best interest of the broad community. And when we say that the economy is part of a wider social framework, this isn't moralizing. An economy is more sustainable if it springs up within a stable society in which human needs are addressed and in which people have voice and where all feel that they are really participants. Exclusion weakens any society. Exclusion therefore damages an economy. A society which fosters innovation and participation is the one which fosters the knowledge-based economy that we need. And an economy which fosters only passivity will be a weaker economy. That was the problem with the communist economies, that people became so passive that the economies actually failed. And we see, for example, in my country, in Ireland, that we can measure the changes that are taking place in many positive ways. You know, the unemployment is down, but still, if people don't feel that, and if there are large groups who feel that they are remaining marginalized, then the political stability of the country is at risk. And there's nobody better able to recognize that than our politicians, but they may not be able to answer it. The third no. No to an inequality which spawns violence. Pope Francis believes that an unjust economic system will never produce a peaceful system. I'm always careful about linking exclusion, linking with the poor with violence. The poor are not violent by nature in any way. The poor have far much to do to survive. But again, the Pope says, just as goodness tends to spread, the toleration of evil, which is injustice, tends to expand its baneful influence and quietly undermine any political system, no matter how solid it may appear. That's a clear warning. If every action has its consequences, an evil embedded in the structures of a society has a constant potential for disintegration and death. It is evil crystallized in unjust social structures, and that cannot be the basis of a hope for a better future. He's not saying that the poor tend to violence. He's saying, however, you're not going to have security if people are not secure in their basic needs. Economics belongs within the framework of ethics. What Kant said of philosophy can be applied to economics, namely that for economics to move forward, it must first of all give precedence to ethics. And Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner for economy, still living, stressed that an absence of reference to moral philosophy leads to an impoverishment of economics. Pope John Paul stressed that there are fundamental needs that do not belong on the marketplace as goods that should be just bought and sold. Pope Benedict called for the insertion into economic models of the value of gratuity as a complement to profit. He stressed when we lose hope in a transcendent horizon, we lose a taste for gratuitousness, a taste for the good for its own sake. And all of these are things that have to be brought in to the economic models in which we live. Pope Francis is very attentive to forms of violence, particularly to violence that men and women experience directly. And he looks at this for example, in meeting the leaders of the world social movements, he again used these. He is a great man for picking these phrases. He looked at the three words, tierra, techo, trabajo, which means land, housing, and work, and identified those as three places where people experience violence. Even the question of the environment, he linked with the relationship between people and the land. So when there's an accumulation of land ownership, deforestation, the appropriation of water, the use of toxics in agriculture, these damage both the environment but also people. There's a model of agriculture and financial management which conditions prices and treats food just as any other merchandise. And he said, this is part of the country, this is something that contributes to a global situation where millions go hungry and millions of tons of food are thrown away and the earth is damaged. And for him, global warming is the fruit of a false, even of a sinful relationship between humans and the God-given environment. One particular form of exploitation about which the Pope has constantly spoken is that of the trafficking of human people. It's something he's very strong about, and I've heard him actually spoken to myself about this. It's a worldwide problem. It exists even in corners of the world where people might be surprised to find it. There's trafficking for prostitution and sexual abuse, trafficking of children, trafficking of workers, trafficking of migrants who pay huge sums of money to try to fulfill a dream and only find themselves either at risk or enslaved, even if they don't die in the meantime. I remember speaking at a gathering, a small group with the Pope about trafficking, and I would find that in almost every small town in Ireland, there's somebody who's been trafficked. Last week we were talking, another group, about trafficking on the seas. We tend to forget this, what goes on ships, and people are moved, and workers who have no rights and so on. And it's something that the Pope feels passionately about. When a society is willing to leave part of itself on the fringes, no political programs or resources spent on law enforcement or surveillance systems will inevitably guarantee our peace and our tranquility. The final no, then, is no to the idolatry of money. In his criticism of the domination of money, Pope Francis again begins immediately focusing on the individual person, saying that we've tended in today's economy to look on the human person above all by virtue of his or her ability to consume. We're not people, we're consumers. And we've got an economy which is based on that one dimension of our being. And that is, again, leading us off the track. Now, I'm a strong believer in the importance of the free market. Overall, it has produced a system for the supply of goods and services which has worked better than any other system. But we tend to forget that the market is not a totally rational instrument. People's fears and anxieties, and not just their reasoning, are part of the reality of the market system. Market mechanisms are not pure mathematical systems. Regulation and transparency are a necessary part of a market equation. But for a certain moment in time, there was a fear that almost any external regulation would defeat the freedom which markets require and would be damaging. It's very interesting to see with the outbreak of the Ebola crisis that shares in some pharmaceutical firms went down, but shares in those making protective clothing shot up by over 50%. The market is a remarkable instrument, but it's not necessarily a rational one. Today, we all point the finger at how the lack of, or the ineffectiveness of the regulatory authorities contributed to the recent economic crisis. If you look at the banking crisis in Ireland, the big answer is, where were the regulators? And where were they? They were all experts, but they didn't seem to see the problems when they began to emerge. I think in many cases they were guarding their own economic theories rather than looking at the realities. And the phrase best practice, we use it so often, but very often best practice is greatly influenced by the ideological flavor of the month. And this is one of the things that happened. People were blinded and didn't see that there was a more fundamental problem than they were seeing. And when it comes too late, then it's just too late. The idolatry of money is often at the root of corruption. And corruption invades and infests so many areas of economic activity. When an economy becomes impersonal, lacking a truly human purpose, then self-interest begins to dominate. Corruption and the absence of a clear ethical behavior are at the root of our economic crisis and also about the ecological crisis in so many ways. But I always stress when I talk about corruption that one of the most dominant forms of corruption in our society is inefficiency. Inefficiency in the delivery of public services robs the poor. It's the poor who suffer when the services that are granted are second class. Those who are wealthy, or those who are well off at least, will always find another way. But the poor are dependent on public service, and inefficiency in public service is a great injustice to them. Pope Francis is working on a new document on the environment. The only thing I'll just say is this. His theological reflections are always theological. And remind us of the word creation. The word creation means that we are not the authors. We are not the lords of our planet and our cosmos. Creation means that everything that is good in the world is a gift of God and has to be used according to God's plan, not in the narrow interest of the powerful or of any particular generation. That's a fundamental principle. You notice that I talk about the planet and our cosmos because I have a particular interest in outer space because I was involved in negotiations about disarmament and outer space when I was nuncio in Geneva. And it's interesting to see, what have we sent into space? We've sent weapons systems and weapons control systems. We've sent certain satellites to test out industrial production. And it always frightens me when I see what we're exporting. We're exporting not necessarily the best of what we have. I've taken these four no's, the four no's of Pope Francis, to show how Pope Francis' social reflection is always one focused on the person, and especially on the person who is excluded in any way. His thrust, as I said, is that of reaching out to the peripheries, not just the geographical ones, but the peripheries of human existence in our world. And for him, the precondition of real inclusion is reaching out to those who are abandoned. It's not simply social commentary from a safe distance or a political program of reaching out, but bringing the closeness of Jesus to the poor, because through bringing that closeness to the excluded, we come to understand through them how we find an answer to their challenges. It's from the desire to know and be alongside those who are on the society's margins today that the Pope attains his ability to be such a leader of a different view of society and a different way in which it must be constructed. It would be possible for a convinced atheist to learn the Catechism by heart and still not to be touched by its content. It would be possible to know the compendium of the social teaching of the Church so well as to get a degree summa cum laude from this university, but never have left the comfort of one's home or one university. Social teaching of the Church is not about books and doctrine, it's about something else. The approach of evangelical discernment is different. We must encounter reality and be able to distinguish clearly in that reality what might be the fruit of the kingdom and what runs counter to God's plan. We do that not with pre-prepared, pre-packaged ideas of our own, but it's in encountering the reality. As the Pope wanted it to be done in the Synod, we must do it in the social teaching of the Church. But that's only a first stage. The revolutionary approach of Pope Francis demands also that we go beyond recognizing and discerning spirits, but also, and this is decisive, he says, ourselves choosing movements of the spirit of good and rejecting those of the spirit of evil. Thank you.
We speak so often these days of pre-Vatican II, post-Vatican II. But in many ways, I think what Archbishop Martin has shared with us tonight, the vision and the hope for Pope Francis is a retrieval of the gospel. Go back to the actions of Jesus and act similarly. And so we're very grateful for your insights tonight, and I know that you said you would answer some questions. So, if you put your hand up, I'll come to you with this microphone.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for coming. It was a great talk. I just had a question. In the context of when you talk about revolutionizing social teaching, especially in one of the first documents that the Church made around the law, or not the first in social teaching, would you say it's more of a reiteration or updating of that document? Or is that too simplistic?
I deliberately chose the term revolutionize because it's provocative and because Pope Francis is provocative. Of course, the Rerum Novarum is the sort of founding document of the modern movement of the social teaching of the Church. The fathers of the Church, particularly, had very strong social impact in what they're saying. The social teaching is something that develops. One of my great maestri, who taught me a lot in my life, Cardinal Echegaray, always said that the day after a social encyclical is published, work begins on the next one, and it's being done by those who try to apply the one that's just come out. That there's a constant development. There's a constant application of the social doctrine to new problems as they emerge, although some of the principles are there. What is revolutionary in Pope Francis is that he begins in a very different way, very much linked with the way of St. Ignatius, this idea of discernment. And this constant stress on it's only when you actually have experience of the excluded that you will begin to understand how you respond to them. And he identifies the leaders, therefore, in the reform, not so much in the big industrialists or the big universities. It's again, none of these will work unless somehow or other you find yourself being a person who brings the closeness of Jesus to others. And if that isn't there, then you're probably going to get lost. I think that is something that's quite different. I don't think you will get in the same way. For example, you remember Pope John Paul II on work. This was clearly something coming from his own experience, and he developed a very, very well-developed document on this. The Pope may come to do this in certain ways, but his basic insight, which he repeats day after day, is somehow or other that reaching out to the marginalized is something that's essential, and that the poor teach us. But if we want to do that, the poor don't write books, and they don't go on television, and they don't send tweets. So that there's some way that there's something really deep in this, which should leave every one of us uncomfortable. Because when he says that, I know he's not pointing at you, he's pointing at me. And all of us have to learn that. And I think this is a way he will actually revolutionize the Christian community, and revolutionize the Christian community with a responsibility to take up the solidarity and the various other things which are the principles. I was just saying today that it was Quadragesimo Anno you had on the entire document was published on the front page of the New York Times. But it's very often interesting to read, particularly Rerum Novarum, to read the original English translation, which is appalling as an English translation, but it sets you actually in the context of the world in which it was written. Yeah?
I also want to thank you for your very provocative presentation this evening. Are you familiar with Albert Camus'
You know, I think it's also important to remember these gestures that he does. He doesn't do them to be on the news. He does them to tell us something. He does it and says, "Look, this is what it's about. That's what you have to do." You know, he's a man who, you know, has his own strategy. He knows that, you know, the Lord is not going to give him a long time, but he's very determined to do what he has to do in that time, in a whole series of ways, and he can be quite strong in this. And he wants people to be with him. And on the other hand, at the Synod, he showed a remarkable, what I would call pastoral patience. Something when I was studying theology, we gave all sorts of descriptions of God, but the word patient was never used. But God throughout history was patient with his people. The people always betrayed him, and he continued. And Pope Francis at the Synod, I described him, he's like a father of a largish family which are in constant disagreement. And he knows that the only way you'll come to a conclusion is, you know, take your time, bring them round. There's no point saying, "You shut up now," and that you've lost it once you do that in a family. You probably know better than I do. So he has this patience, and he knows that through this type of sharing and through, you know, he never said one word during the Synod. He didn't have a pencil with him. You know, it's that Pope Benedict at a Synod had a pen, and he had what do you call these yellow highlighter and worked all the time. Pope John Paul, and this isn't a secret, and I'm not revealing any secret, Pope John Paul read books during the Synod. I remember one day he's saying, I was at a lunch, and he said at the end of the lunch to a priest, "Father," he said, "I'm very grateful to you. I'm reading your book during the Synod." He had this ability to do two things at the one time. It was a well-known part of his characteristic. But Pope Francis, he arrived. Big surprise was the Synod began Monday morning at 9 o'clock. 20 minutes to 9 he was there. And this normally didn't happen. And cardinals who arrived at 9:05 found that things were well underway and had to try and find their way. But like good cardinals, the next day they were all there at 20 to 9 to try and talk to him. But he was there every day. He was there at every coffee break. He mingled with everybody, allowed people selfies to be taken. But you know, he sat there, he listened, he didn't show any reaction, either positive or negative. He said at the end of the morning session, "Buon appetito," and in the evening session, "Buon riposo." But you know, this was part of a strategy of what I call pastoral patience in allowing everybody to speak. And we're not quite used to that. And I think some people may have overreacted in one way or the other to that. What we have to do now is to move forward with the agenda of the Synod over the coming year to ensure that more and more people are able to bring their contribution. And this is the same in the social teaching of the Church. But you know, he again has this idea of solidarity, but it's solidarity with those who are in solitude. But there's also something about of a mystic in himself, that these quick remarks, which are not due just to a good sense of humor, but to something very deep in that. One of the things I do if I have a free Sunday, which is very rarely, is I go out to the retirement homes of religious congregations. And I went out to one Irish congregation, and the Pope had given an interview the previous day in which he said, "Religious life is not like a bottle of distilled water." What is the word now? Transparent, tasteless, and colourless. You know, and it's a fascinating phrase. But I said it to these old nuns who were there, many of them in wheelchairs, and I said to them, "You know, when you entered religious congregation, you didn't want that, did you?" And I said, "There's a bit of spark left in you," and they were nearly raising their fists, sort of in saying, "Yeah, we're there." But if if we lose that, if we lose it in our own faith, then we become like a bottle of distilled water. That is really not all that helpful to anybody. We need that bit of spark and spirit in the way we do things. Sorry, I need some water.
Maybe one last question.
Yes, thank you again for coming tonight. It was wonderful. I couldn't have missed it because my mother would have had me for missing an Irish bishop. So, but I wanted to ask, in this kind of unique setting of being on the university and also in parish, how Francis's revolutionizing Catholic social teaching should lead us to rethink the mission of universities, Catholic universities, and the mission of parishes.
I think obviously the bringing that spark and that evangelical spark into whatever we do, and looking at the universities are extremely important because this is where research goes on, and if you bring that sense of solidarity into learning and knowledge are so important. For the progress of humankind. But learning should be something that, it's like fresh air, it should expand and involve everyone. And there's a real danger today that even the fruits of knowledge, which are, when we say the goods of the earth are destined for everyone, that includes human genius and knowledge. And there's a danger that these can be again divided up and that knowledge becomes part of a competitive market rather than coming together. But this is particularly the case with regards to progress in health. You know, I often use the analogy of two students go into to study medicine, and their aim is really to improve humankind, and they're both very committed to them. And then they both go, and one is employed by one pharmaceutical firm and the other is employed by the other, maybe fighting to combat the same disease, and they can't talk to one another because there are now commercial interests that are involved, and that isn't the purpose of science, and there's something wrong when that happens. You see, there's so much money now to be got. If you can find a cure to certain things, there's a huge amount of money, and therefore knowledge becomes really an economic activity rather than that. I think the other thing I'd say in universities is, if I could find it here, I'd just repeat it, what the Pope says. Say what you think. There's no place better than the ability to do that than in university years. Don't become a conformist. Don't become closed in on your own ideas. Don't think you've got the answers. Let everybody in a university say what they think and share this knowledge, and grow up with an attitude of openness to the ideas of others. I think that's an extremely important thing, and encourage creativity in others and rejoice in creativity with others. Especially if you ever move into a teaching ability, this again is one of the things. But the other one is those who come to university are the privileged in our societies, and privilege brings responsibility, and privilege brings with it a desire to be sensitive to the others who may not have the abilities. We live in a society where there's so many exclusions, and you can be privileged, but you don't have to live as the privileged. You can live in a different way. And that is the starting point. Now, I wouldn't like to give the impression that Pope Francis has moved away to an idea that social teaching of the Church is simply a disincarnated spiritual experience. What he's saying is that this ability to discern from the Gospels and from the encounter between the message and the lives of people is something that will bring an added quality into the professional life of those who take that on. I remember one head of an international organization who I knew very well. He had two deputies, one was a Muslim and one was a Jew. And both of them said to me, our Director General is a Catholic. It means a lot to him. He's not going to try and convert us. But we all know that his faith brings an added quality to his work, something that it's hard to explain. And I remember asking him and a number of others at a particular period, how did you get on so well in international life? And they all said the same answer to me, Gaudium et Spes. They were children of the Vatican Council. And from that discussion about the role of the church in the modern world, they developed an international vocation. And that Christian international vocation that they got actually made them do very well in their professional life. And I think that's an important thing, that you set values in your life which have a broad opening towards others, and that you learn to do that in whatever part of whatever dimension of your life, in your personal life, in your family life, and in your professional life. And faith can do that if we allow it to do that. But if we allow our faith to be parceled off in another dimension, we won't have a strong faith, and we won't have a fulfilled life. I still have time for. I'm only. If there's anybody else, but if there isn't, okay, we leave it at that. Then
Thank you.